Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm happy to have Helen King on the podcast. Helen is Professor Emerita of Classical Studies at the Open University. She's also an elected member of the General Synod of the Church of England, where she's Vice Chair of Together, which campaigns on a range of discrimination issues, including discrimination on the grounds of gender or sexuality. And she is the author of many books, including the latest, Immaculate Forms, A History of the Female Body in 4 Parts. And that's what we discussed in the conversation. As I say in the conversation, I've always found these topics really interesting. Mostly this isn't my experience. So it's always really nice to hear and see and learn more about an experience that's not my own. We talk about the overview of the 4 parts that she covers in her book. Those 4 parts are breast, clitoris, hymen, and womb of the female body. We discuss how medicine has shaped positive and negative ideas about the female body. We talk specifically about each of those parts. With breast, we talk about how they are used for pleasure and for nurture. We talk about the mysteriousness of the clitoris and how people in historical past have been trying to, quote unquote, find it. We talk about FGM, female genital mutilation. We talk about also the mystery around the hymen and some of the cultural implications it's had over the years. And we also talk about the womb and how that is distinct and some of the interesting features there historically and many other topics. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. She was such a delight to talk to and just very open about talking about the female body and a lot of the historical implications and what it means in understanding the female body today. So she was quite lovely. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So get over there, subscribe, share with your friends. I'm also on YouTube. If you like this conversation, there are many others like it. So plenty for you to dig around there and listen to some more conversations on similar topics. And now I bring you Helen King. I am here with Helen King. Helen, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking with you.
It's a great pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You've written an excellent book. I really enjoyed it. The book is called Immaculate Forms, A History of the Female Body in 4 Parts. So we'll talk all about it, which I'm excited to do. Before we do, just tell listeners what's the snapshot of you professionally, academically, and anything you're currently up to?
Sure. So I'm sort of retired. I retired from the Open University, which is the distance learning online university in the UK, in 2017. I really liked working there, but I didn't much like management. So managing a department was just a complete nightmare. So after being head of department, I thought, actually, I think I could do something else with my life. So I retired and started writing this book. So it's been going for, about 7 years, I guess.
Wow.
It's quite a long time, because then there's COVID, of course, and I sort of stopped in COVID. I know some people were really prolific in COVID.
Yeah.
Loved the break, just got on with writing. I just couldn't. I was just a nervous wreck. So nothing happened for a few years. And then I got back to it again. And
So you started writing and then took a break and then picked it back up. Interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't ideal, I think. I had to really get back into it again. But then that was fine once I got going again. That was good. And the rest of my life is really occupied in running the Church of England in my spare time, is what I call it. I'm an elected member of the General Synod of the Church of England, which is the governing body, elected for my diocese. And I'm the chair of Together on General Synod, which is the group that works on inclusion. So that's all sorts of inclusion, so racial, class, gender, LGBT equality, all of those. So I chair that. So when Synod is in session, that's sort of occupies me completely. So we just finished a February meeting, and you've just got me now at the point when I've almost recovered from sitting in church debates with bishops and things. It's an interesting double role. But I couldn't have done that if I hadn't retired, because it's an awful lot of work.
Yeah.
It's not just meetings; it's also reading all the papers before the meetings and trying to keep on top of the politics of it all. So, it's all bodies and very fraught things, aren't they? And the Church of England's fear of bodies, I think, is quite intense.
Yeah.
It's one of the things that's behind the book.
Yeah. Is it true? I could totally be wrong on this. N.T. Wright, do you know N.T. Wright? I think he was associated with Church of England too, right? I don't know if he still is. He was up there in Scotland, wasn't he?
He's a very, very prolific writer.
Yes, he is.
I've got various of his Bible study sort of books, where he goes through a particular book of the Bible in great detail. Yeah, he's very much around.
Yeah. That's really cool. Actually, to see kind of you're in two worlds of sorts. So you're training. By training, you're a historian, correct?
Yeah, my first degree was ancient history and social anthropology.
Nice.
So I've always been interested in the social side of things, social science, particularly the methods of anthropology, as you can apply them to ancient texts, where obviously you can't go and live with the people you're studying,
right.
but you can immerse yourself in the culture and try and find what in fact they were going on about, rather than just seeing them as weird or as our ancestors, perfectly right in every possible way. Trying to understand how they saw their world in their own terms.
Yeah, that's important. Just kind of taking things in the context, but then also understanding, that there's a lot of applicability still from understanding things in context, but how things, so a lot of times we, myself included, a lot of people don't recognize how much we still use certain ideas or certain things from a different time, and it just never updates, which is always interesting to see some of those things.
I agree.
So this book is, I wouldn't say, maybe the way you kind of describe yourself is sort of kind of comes through in the book. It's not pure history. There is history in the book, but there's a social component to it as well that you kind of cover, which I really like is in terms of reading it. So I've always, as a guy, as a male, I am always interested in things that are not true for me, or things I'm not going to experience, or certain kinds of other experiences. And so, in terms of reading about the female body was nice for me. It's always illuminating because I don't have that experience, and so it's always kind of new information in some way. So there's a lot of stuff I did know in here from reading and various conversations, but there was so much I didn't, and so it was like a build on some areas of knowledge and then illuminated other new areas. So it's really great. At least for me, that was very, very.
I think
very, very
that's the sort of read I like to do. Where you've got something to bring to it.
Yeah,
it's all completely new to you. You don't have anything to get a handle on it, do you? But it's when something you do know then gets retold slightly differently.
Exactly. Yeah. Ooh. Yeah. It's really nice because then it sort of continues to shape it and see a kind of a bigger lens on it. So it definitely did that. You start your story or kind of the book. I should note that there's the 4 parts here. So you basically dedicate a kind of these long chapters on each is breasts, clitoris, hymen, and womb as the major 4 parts. I guess you talk about that history helps us understand how our bodies, but not necessarily in a linear fashion. Why did you choose to focus on these 4 areas? Now, maybe it kind of seems obvious of sorts. You think of the female body, what is distinctly there that's not for males or anyone else. But why did you want to discuss these 4 parts when discussing kind of the historic and present female body?
Yeah, when I started, I was going to do a lot more parts. I was going to do things like hair, brain, and then a voice, things that have been used to say, "Oh, that's not what a woman should be like." But it just got too much. And I realized that if I was going to do a chapter on how the female brain has been seen, I would have to do an awful lot more research on brains, because I've never worked on brains. So my academic work, before I wrote this book for a general reader, was very much on the history of gynecology and obstetrics.
I see.
So that was the sort of area I knew about. And I didn't know enough. I felt I'd done a little bit on the history of the clitoris, the history of the hymen. I'd done a lot on the history of the womb, and I'd done nothing on breasts. So I started writing with the breasts chapter on the grounds that you start by writing the thing you don't know about so that you don't get too bogged down in knowing too much. So actually, that was an interesting way of doing it. So also, I wanted to go from what's visible to what's invisible.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yes, so breasts, clitoris, hymen, womb going further and further inside the body, so that it's about what you can see, but it's also about what people have imagined
Mm,
is going on in the places you can't see.
mm,
What is the womb like? Is it like a ravenous animal rushing around the body?
mm,
Is it like an octopus grabbing things with its tentacles? What's it like?
mm,
And realizing there are lots and lots of different ways of thinking about that before we got to the modern era, where we can do scans and we can see what's going on,
mm, mm,
and we've got some idea of the inside of the body. So it was very much about that. That is linear in terms of the ways that we look into the body, the ways we can learn about the body.
mm.
But the conclusions we come to aren't necessarily linear. And we forget things. Historically, we forget things completely, and then they turn up again a few centuries later as, oh, look, I've just found a new thing.
Mm.
So there's a sort of linear thing going in terms of how we know.
Mm.
But then there's a non-linear thing going on in terms of what we do with the information we've got.
Mm. Yeah, that kind of outside inside definitely comes out, which
Good.
is really 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 nice. Um, it's interesting how exactly what you're saying. At present, we as humans understand a bit more, but as you're saying
Mm.
in context, a lot of people didn't. So they had to make up all these ideas, or they had to speculate, or which to be fair is it's reasonable, I guess, for people to try and do that. But there's something you mentioned early on. I think she's mentioned in the book too. Kat Bohannon wrote a great book
Yes.
called
Eve.
Eve. Great
Yeah.
book. I talked to her on the podcast.
Yeah. It's a
Maybe
great
when the
book.
book came out. She's lovely. Um, and it came up there too. And I think most people understand it. Maybe with your historic lens or kind of your piece here, that medicine has been sort of, but maybe not always, but for a majority of time in history, this sort of gatekeeper of female bodies. Like, traditionally it was all men for most of, history past. And that has changed significantly in the past, 30 to 50 years. But I guess, how has it been a gatekeeper? And I guess it seems on the face of it to be a very negative thing, which I think it is. But what's, I guess, a perspective of looking at how medicine has shaped how societies or cultures will know about the female body and or have lots of ignorance about the female body that still maybe trickles in or persists even today?
I think there's something there about basically being human, that once you've got something wrong with your body, when things aren't working, you are desperate for help. And if someone can say to you, we've got the knowledge, we've got the answers, then that's very powerful, isn't it? And
Mm,
so if medicine says, actually, we understand how the body works, and we can explain everything that's going on in your body, and we can give you a cure. Now, you take that to the ancient Greeks. Woman has pain in her shoulder. Medical explanation: your womb has wandered and got stuck in your shoulder.
mm,
It's not right, but it's an explanation.
mhm,
And if then you can say, well, look, I can give you this herb which will encourage your womb to go back into its correct place, you'll take the herb, won't you? It's something about desperation
mm,
and needing someone to take control when you feel that you're out of control. So I think that's what medicine does. It says, we've got the answers, we've got an explanation, and we've got something you can do to make yourself better. When you're desperate, you go for that, don't you?
mm,
And we like to feel we can control our bodies, but if something happens that isn't expected
mm,
and isn't familiar to us,
mm,
we are very vulnerable to someone saying, I can explain this. So I
mhm,
think it's about control and fear when things aren't working right. And it's also something about the natural. It's the idea that this is absolutely natural. This is not cultural. See, I would say medicine is cultural. It always comes out of a context of beliefs about, in this case, about women and what women are. But medicine presents itself as scientific and natural, having all the answers, and not something you can dispute. That is how your body is.
mm,
Nothing you can do about it.
mm,
That's what a woman is. Of course, you should expect this thing to happen.
mm.
So something like endometriosis,
Yeah.
which I've had and lots
Mm,
of women do,
mhm,
that's been explained in so many ways historically. At one point, it was the career woman's disease. It was all because you wanted a life outside the home. And that's why your body decided to malfunction.
mm,
That's completely gone out the window. it was quite obviously something which was being said to stop women getting outside their domestic roles. But of course, we don't actually know still what causes endometriosis. It's another one of these diseases where medicine has explanations, but they're not actually as fixed as you might think. Is it to do with tissue that's already in the wrong place when you're born? Is it due to tissue migrating and bleeding in the wrong places? Is it something to do with chemicals? Is it the environment? We don't really know that. But historically, explanations have come as if must be true. It's a fact.
Mm-hmm. I wonder. When I was reading the book, I was thinking, what are the things that we think about now that in 50 years we're going to be like, how do we think that? And you can't really fault people in the moment for thinking certain ways. Sometimes you can, for sure, but a lot of the times it is. Well, this is what we're dealing with. This is the information we have. This is all we got for now. But it is interesting to look at it differently.
If you don't say it with authority to the patient, it's not good. Patients are very interesting. The whole patient-doctor relationship. Patients historically have wanted their doctors to give them an answer and have been likely to believe it. Now, because of the internet, we're much more open to the idea that maybe the doctors don't know either. The classic is the internet patient who turns up with a printout from their computer and says, well, I think I've got this, this, and this. But on some level, we still want the doctor to give us the answer. If you go to your doctor and say, they give you options, you could do this, you could do that. You want to know what to do, don't you?
Yeah.
You really want to be told.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. I certainly want to be told. I hate having choices.
Well, it's that, but people, when they have uncertainty or when they know, when they don't know something or they're confused by it or whatever, that's where it's like, well, I'm coming here because I want answers. And so then if somebody comes in and they don't have answers, they're like, well, why am I here? I mean, I could just stay on my Google search and that would have been a little bit easier. So, but I think that's where it becomes really, really imperative to have a good dialogue and to have a good kind of relationship with your treating physician.
Of course, the other thing is the way in which people have learned about the body. So once dissection becomes a key part of medicine, that I think changes the game to some extent in terms of what is normal. It's about what you see, isn't it? So once you can start dissecting bodies and finding bits of the body that you maybe didn't know about before, then you can really define what is a normal body. Because you've looked at lots of bodies and they've all been like this. Therefore, the next body you see, you say, that's not right. That's definitely not right. So there's something there also about the different forms of knowledge we have. When you're just looking at a patient and talking to them, it's very different from being able to look inside the body. And of course, with imaging, you don't need dissection. You can do it with a living person. You can see what's happening inside. But you still have to interpret it. There's always interpretation rather than just absolute certainty. It's a very interesting area.
Yeah, there's never any real certainty, but you can, make some, I guess, confident statements. But you start off, as you described, with talking about women's breasts. So obviously, men have breasts, but it's totally different in terms of functionality, in terms of how we view them in society. Even down to norms of well, I guess it depends on which country or certain areas that you're in, but for the most part, a dude goes to the beach, takes his shirt off, no one blinks twice. A woman goes to the beach, takes her shirt off, and people raise their eyebrows at least. For a long time, or even still today, I mean, I don't think it's inaccurate, but you describe how women's breasts have been seen as a secondary sex characteristic, and even that's how I think when women, or when young girls are going through puberty, that's how it's described as these are one of the secondary sex characteristics. But you do this interesting thing about throughout history, there's like these two components, and so you can bring in the history here, and you can use as much as you want there, but about women's breasts have been seen as a sexual object, as a feature of pleasure, as something that's if you want to use Darwin, it's one of the sexual ornaments, right?
Right.
For some of the arousal and for reproduction and all these things, in terms of traction. But it's also used as it's seen very much so as maternal, and this feature of nurturing. So you have these two parts of the body for females that are really can. I mean, maybe not at the same time, obviously, but they are seen as two very different things, which is very, very fascinating. Even I'll just use as an example: if somebody looks online about, um, they look at, let's say, Google Images or I don't know, YouTube, and they look at women breastfeeding, right?
Mm.
There's nothing sexualized about that, right? It's oh, this is a mother with an infant. It's there's feeding, there's nurturing, all these things. But if you were to look up just women's breasts or whatever, and I'm sure some sexualized images will pop up for sure. And it's interesting because it's the same body part, right? And so how do you tell us, I guess, this story of how, at the very least, I'm not trying to make it this dichotomy, I don't think you are either, but you get these two major ways of how in society and through societies in the past as well. It's not just in the West, so to speak. We have these two kinds of schemas, if you will, about how we as a society think about women's breasts.
Yeah, and if you mix the two, that's considered completely
Oh, as a
unacceptable.
taboo, yeah, right,
No,
yeah.
absolutely not.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of it's to do with visibility, that these are the parts
Mm.
that many women, not all women, some women have bigger breasts than others, basic fact. And so you may not have really very visible breasts, but if you've got anything there, there's all this history, a long history of clothing which can emphasize the breasts or hide the breasts.
Mm.
So you've got a sort of choice as to whether you're up front there. I mean, tits out being the sort of key phrase, whether it's tits out or whether you just try and sort of keep it under control.
Mm.
And you can suppress your breasts and you can throw your breasts out at people.
Mm.
It's a very interesting thing. You can perform basically with your breasts. They are a way of showing femininity or reducing femininity, depending on what you want to do with them, in a way that other body parts really aren't.
Mm.
And yeah, that sort of taboo on when they mix, I think, is very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I have a quote in the book about breasts being for show, not for use.
Mm.
Some people's breasts historically have been for show, others for use. If you've got breasts for show, do you then use them? And then you look at all those images of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I find those fascinating because there somehow it's okay to show a breast because it's a breastfeeding breast.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a sexual breast. But then if you have a woman showing her breast, feeding a child, clothing all disheveled, there's a sort of sexual thing going on with the disheveled clothing in a way that having your breast out and saying, this is what I'm using for breastfeeding, is a different message from saying, look, here's my breasts.
Mm.
It's a very complex thing.
Yeah.
And as you say, men have breasts too. At least they have nipples and they have breast tissue, and men can get breast cancer, which is one of those interesting facts which shows that men's health can be disadvantaged too by saying only women have breasts, because no, men do too, actually. I don't know if you'd read anything before about the other sort of weird breast tissue I talk about, accessory breasts, where you have breast tissue somewhere else in your body. I have a couple of examples in the book, where
that's right.
someone's got a breast on their leg. I mean,
yes,
for goodness
that's right.
sake. And you can have a breast tissue on another part of your body with a nipple attached, and it can even produce milk.
Mm.
I mean, that shows something about breast tissue, which is just not there in that image that only women have breasts.
Mm.
It's actually more complicated. The sorts of binaries that those body parts suggest keep getting deconstructed, not just by history, but by biology. There's breast tissue in other places. Men can produce milk.
Yeah.
It's usually that is because of a hormonal imbalance.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a sort of standard thing, but it can be done. The breast chapter seems to have got people's imagination quite strongly because it has examples like the guy at parties who squirts his breast milk at people as a party trick. the 18th century guy who makes cheese out of his own breast milk.
Mm-hmm.
There are all sorts of extraordinary boundary crossing things happening at the same time as what we're really supposed to be talking about at this point, which is that maternal versus sexual, that you can't somehow, as a woman, have both going at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But using your breasts in a sexual fashion, you then get pregnant and then produce the milk, which makes your breasts into maternal breasts, but they're still somehow sexual. And look at, I don't know what it's like in your country, but in our country, there's still stuff about breastfeeding in public.
Oh
You
yeah.
have to have
oh yeah. Oh, it's
a thing that you sort of cover yourself up with.
It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing.
It's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
You just can't do it.
No, you
But
can't do it.
at that point, that is not a sexualized breast. It's a maternal breast, but it's still got that hint of the sexual, hasn't it?
Yeah, which is interesting. It is interesting because you're right that a woman's breast, you can't. It's more visible. And I'm not talking about size or shape or anything, just generally, and for the most part. And so it's becoming like more visible during breastfeeding, right? Just very visible. But I'm not sure why there's this desire to want to cover, or in this context, right? In a maternal nurturing context. I don't quite get it. I don't know if if in society people are, in civilized modern society, that people are so, startled or I don't understand. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, anytime I've seen a woman out in public, at a restaurant or on a train or something, they're breastfeeding. I just look at it as, almost in a endearing way. It's like, oh, that's a really nice moment to see, a woman, giving, nurturing her child, and like I just see it as endearing, and that's it. I keep moving. The whole kind of like taboo of it is strange. It's very strange.
It really is. It really is. And it's not something which has bothered people in history. I think it is one of our more recent developments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, there can be taboos about breastfeeding in other contexts, and we'll talk about those later probably. But the basic thing of a woman feeding a baby, it's not an issue.
Tell me, I guess one question here. This will apply here, but it will apply probably in other contexts as well. But you mentioned some of the other parts, and this is the question, right? I mean, in terms of, Simone de Beauvoir, she posed this question. Other people have posed this question about what does it mean to be a woman, right? And people still ask that today, and there are all sorts of, complications and challenges and more things to consider today. But I think what most people would answer, I mean, again, I'm not a woman, so, but I think what I've heard is that most people usually say at some point in the conversation, there will be some signal or pointing to, physical characteristics, right? Of yes, men have breasts or nipples, but it's different for women, et cetera. And so, and again, there's all sorts of combinations of this stuff now, but generally in the majority, I mean, my question here is how much, I don't know, this is subjective, of course, but, how appropriate is it to put, breasts or how those are aligned with womanhood, like how women see, again, not that you speak for all women, but when we're thinking about that throughout history and all these things, it does seem to be one of the features or one of the variables of what we think about when we think of, defining, a woman and things like that, in terms of some of the makeup or to delineate between, men or anything else. I guess, yeah, how do you think about its contribution towards, womanhood of sorts? I mean, again, it's a tricky question, but what do you make of that question?
Yeah, it's a tricky one because what it makes me think of course, is that point that as a woman, once you start breast buds, I love the word buds. It's part of that whole floral imagery
the floral
in our body, which is huge.
Mm-hmm.
So once you start budding, you then have to wear a training bra. I mean, what a concept! A training bra. These are tiny little things that don't really support anything. So there's nothing there to support at that point. But it's a big thing about becoming a woman.
Yeah.
To be a woman is to wear a bra, which is why when the feminist movement started, the idea of burning your bra is so powerful. It's denying all that language about how this is what you should be like. It's also very constraining.
Yeah.
Bras are very constraining. It's about somehow shutting your body up, controlling, and training to be a woman. It's quite extraordinary how important that is. Certainly was when I was growing up. Big thing, and you compare yourself with other girls in the class whose breasts are growing more than others, and it's a big, big thing. And yet, when you grow up, you realize actually people have different sorts of breasts, and big deal. It's not so important, but it's a huge thing. And I think it does get back to basically that visibility point. It's one way you signal that you're a woman is by having breasts. When you think about the discussions on things like women wearing very high heels and so on, which are obviously very bad for your feet, but there is something about the posture that it thrusts your breasts out. So that's why you wear high heels. It's, again, that's all about breasts. They're very, very important. Certainly now, even now, despite the fact we've been through periods like 1920s, the flappers, where that's a very flat look, but breasts just keep making a comeback.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I'm the wrong person to ask, so I don't really have any opinions on these things. But it is. I always like to hear people's different opinions or their different ideas about this. I've heard different opinions as well, and so it's always interesting to see where it kind of features or doesn't. I guess the one other thing here about on the female breast is this idea. You talk about it in ancient Greece and Rome and things like that about breast milk, right? And even still to this day, people talk about this idea of the fluid component, right? This idea of breastfeeding versus bottle feeding, all these things. There's, again, still, people debate this in literature and things like that. But, and what do we, I guess, think about in terms of, this is more probably on the nurturing kind of component of sorts, but people get kind of fixated on which is more appropriate, which is better. And again, from what I've heard from women that will share these things, is that there's if there's a new mom and they're wanting to breastfeed and they can't for some reason, right? And that this happens, not too, it's not maybe very common, but it does happen. It does happen often enough that there's a sense of like, maybe shame. There's all these negative feelings around it that
Failure.
Failure, and again, this idea of like motherhood or womanhood being attached to a kind of, am I as functional in this moment as I should be or not, or less than, if all these ideas, you can know they're true or not true, or all these things that but it does have some kind of thing, and I maybe the argument is, well, that's just historical medicine, putting that in your head over hundreds of years, and it's not really that, but people still feel what they feel. What do we think about, I guess, this idea of this emphasis on breast milk and the saliency of it or not?
Yeah, it's the idea that you are somehow a failure if you can't feed your own child. Although it happens, and it shouldn't be seen as a failure. There are alternatives. Fine. But it's something about giving yourself for that child, isn't it? Something, the image of maternity as sacrifice. You are giving your body from your body to that child. Now, we know that historically, lots of alternatives have been used. So donkey milk was used very much when, in the 19th century, when people couldn't breastfeed, because it was seen as being nearer to human milk. And apparently there is something in that in terms of different animal milks.
Interesting.
And there was even something called direct udder feeding, where you could put a baby directly under the animal to suck from the animal.
Oh my goodness.
Which is quite a shock to us, because it's that whole human-animal boundary there. We think, oh, we're human, they're animals, different. We drink cow's milk, sure, but we don't drink it from the cow. But babies were put underneath donkeys because not everyone can breastfeed, fact. And that fact has been acknowledged. But interestingly, there's other things with milk. So in the ancient world, Greek and Roman world, the first milk, colostrum, which we believe contains the antibodies that help the baby's health, that was seen as disgusting and hideous and far too thick and not proper milk. So you didn't give it to babies. You would, when you got a newborn baby, you would have it suckle from someone who was already breastfeeding rather than from its mother who was still producing colostrum. So there, the thing that we think is valuable was seen as unpleasant and you shouldn't give it to babies, which is fascinating, I think. But even in the ancient world, there's a reference to somewhere, a column in ancient Rome, where people would go to get wet nurses to get people to suckle their child because not everybody could. Okay, so it can be because the mother's died in childbirth, therefore you need someone else to suckle the child. But it can just be she can't feed. So there was an awareness that you need substitutes. And of course, that starts to get tricky because if you think the bond between the mother and the baby is somehow so great that must be the mother's milk to feed the child, what if you then have someone who is a slave to feed the child of a freeborn person? You're using an enslaved woman. That's sort of dodgy, isn't it? Because you really want the child to have its mother's milk because belief was always that virtues were transmitted in the milk. The mother's moral qualities were transmitted in the milk. What if the wet nurse is someone from a different racial group that you normally would despise, but hey, you really desperately need that child fed, so we'll use that person's milk? And then there are all sorts of other interesting issues, worrying issues that follow from that. So if you take a woman who is breastfeeding her own child, use her as a wet nurse for an elite child, then that means she can't feed her own child, who then may well suffer as a result of not getting enough milk. So you're damaging the child of the enslaved woman who's being used as the wet nurse. So there's all sorts of things going on there. There's also the idea of using someone who's a friend. And that happens today still, that you have people who will suckle each other's child because actually it doesn't matter whose milk it is, it's milk. And yet that still seems quite an odd thing to do because of that overriding narrative, which is saying it's your baby, it's your body, it's their body, your body gave birth to their body, your body continues to feed their body. There's an awful lot tied up in that.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine so. I mean, there's this, I mean, just as a parent, but I know that there's, many people have written about and talked about, motherhood and what that's like and feeling this, symbiotic bond with the child. And so, yeah, to have that kind of happen would be, I'm sure it would cause some kind of, feelings or reaction to that. So
but what comes down to a base is that child needs to be fed.
Yes, right, in terms of the utility.
Find anybody else, if there isn't a person, then you will try animal milk. You will try anything. The most important thing is to keep the child alive. But nevertheless, the sense of failure, because you couldn't do it yourself. And that is wrong, but it's historically been very common. Doesn't help, of course, again, back to Mary feeding Jesus. The Christian church was saying, well, Mary fed her own child Jesus, therefore you should feed your child. Oh, great. Let's just really pile on the pressure there.
Right. That's funny. Okay, so the clitoris. This is the. Again, I don't know how it is. You tell me how it is over there across the pond, but over here in the United States, people don't. I'm sure some people listening to this are gonna tense up. Just me saying the word and talking about it, and
it's amazing.
I'm not really sure.
It's the same this side of the pond.
Why? I don't understand why. I mean, it's a part of the body.
Exactly.
It's against part of the female body. It's
right.
fantastic for women to get derive immense amounts of pleasure. I think that's fantastic. So again, I mean, it's again a bit strange. I mean, I get it in some ways of how it is in day-to-day kinds of stuff for people, but yeah, I mean, so you kind of talk about that, right? We don't really, a lot of people don't know about it. They don't know what it looks like, where it is, internally what it looks like, all these things. Yeah.
It's the classic, isn't it? The big joke about clitoris is you can't find it. I'm just really right. That is a big joke.
Where do we first see it I guess, documented in history, or where do we first hear it talked about of sorts? And what's this evolution about how people have thought about the clitoris?
Well, it's mentioned in ancient Greek and Roman medical texts, but often in the context of one that's sort of somehow too large. And that, again, it's another racial thing here. So there's always a thing about how Greeks and Romans believe that their clitorises are just fine, but the ones of other people, so Egyptians in particular, that are somehow too big and therefore need to be dealt with. And that there are surgical descriptions of how you reduce the size of a clitoris, which are really scary. These are from the early Roman Empire. They were operating on clitorises. So they knew about them, and they believed that an extra large clitoris meant that you were somehow badly behaved, out of control, lascivious, bad thing. So, but that was always projected onto other people. Other races were the problem. Our clitorises were fine. And there's a superb fragment of a poem by Sappho from maybe 6th century BCE, where she talks about the little red apple at the top of the tree, which the people plucking the apples can't reach. It's this idea of this sort of secret place that's special and sweet and precious and out of reach of men.
It still is today for most men.
Yeah, well, there you go. So it goes back a really, really long way. But despite that, there's this moment in the 16th century, 1559. I'm usually rubbish at remembering years, so I always remember this one. 1559, Realdo Colombo, a medical guy, said he discovered the clitoris. And you think, really? 1559? Although it's there in ancient Greek and Roman texts, it's in medieval texts called the chickpea, which is interesting. It's there. But Realdo Colombo reckons he's found it, and he describes how he has discovered this oblong part of the body, and if you touch it, even with your little finger, the woman goes completely wild with pleasure, and she spurts seed all over the place. Wow, what is going on here? And it was considered a disgusting thing to have said. Don't tell anybody. Oh, goodness, we don't want to know about that. And he acts like it's new. Of course it's not new. It's like you get credit for discovering the clitoris, right? It's like, oh, great doctor, he discovered something. So, 1559, the discovery of the clitoris. But it's always been there. The question has been, what's it for? That's what people in the ancient world were never really sure about. Was it about pleasure, just pleasure? Because purely pleasure is obviously not a good thing. It must have a purpose. And the other argument was that the pleasure somehow helped the woman to conceive. So remember, one of the many theories of how conception happens is that both men and women produce seed. So the stuff that comes when Colombo describes touching the clitoris is female seed. You need the female seed and the male seed to make the baby. So if the woman has pleasure, she will produce seed, and she's therefore more likely to conceive. So actually, sexual pleasure becomes a route to conception. And that's not the unanimous view of all ancient medical authorities, but it's certainly one of the models of the body that's around. So there, female pleasure becomes important because it's important to conception. It's essential to conception. If you don't believe that you need female pleasure, if you believe that men plant their seed inside a woman like, planting a seed in the earth, and then that seed grows, and some woman's body somehow nurtures it, keeps it safe. The woman's blood maybe helps it grow. You don't need pleasure in that model. So there are different historical models competing with each other, coexisting with each other, which give you different views as to whether pleasure is actually necessary or not.
So again, it's almost like maybe a false dichotomy, but this idea, is it for procreation, or is it just for pleasure, or is it for both?
Yeah, it's rather like the breasts with the sexuality and the maternal. Yes.
I guess through time, where do we see it kind of come about? I mean, we know it can obviously be very pleasurable for a woman, but how have we evolved, I guess, on this understanding of the utility, I guess, if you will, of the clitoris?
It's changed because we have got much more knowledge of the extent of the clitoris now. In that image of the clitoris as chickpea, as this tiny little thing, as this invisible, almost invisible part that you can't find, has been completely blown out of the water by the work of Helen O'Connell in the 1990s, working from MRI of women and showing the extent of the clitoris, that actually this is a huge organ. This is not some tiny little thing. It's a huge wishbone-shaped organ, which has more nerve endings than a penis and extends far further than just the visible part. And that really has changed views of female sexuality. But even that is not as new as we may think. Helen O'Connell herself referenced a 19th century German doctor who, from dissections, came to the same conclusion, that this was a much bigger organ than people thought it was. So medicine has had some quite interesting things to say about the clitoris. It's discovered, then its extent is discovered, then it's completely forgotten about. Then medical textbooks in the 1920s and 30s didn't even bother to show it because, completely irrelevant. It disappears, and then it comes back again. It's one of those non-linear moments in the history of the female body.
Yeah, I mean, I think the wishbone shape and how much larger the clitoris is, but then also I think that there was some idea that maybe it extended out too much, but then it's actually quite compact, right? Internalized for the woman. Of course, you get there's a few other things you talk about with the clitoris. You talk about where does female masturbation come into the picture here, or mutual pleasure between two partners. There's obviously tons of floral imagery that's used, as you were mentioning, or this kind of chickpea thing with kind of certain kinds of
chickpeas, rosebuds, flowers.
Yeah, it's very
petals.
very interesting how we make those kind of examples. And then you also, I think, it was in this chapter, I think I'm right on this, you bring up my good buddy Freud and some of his ideas about some of this stuff as well. I mean, he wrote a lot about sex, of course. What do we think about kind of, this is more on the social cultural thing about how we've talked about it more modernly about the clitoris and images we use and pleasure and things like that.
Yeah, so with Freud, it's this idea that somehow you've got to mature from clitoris being the source of pleasure to the vagina being the source of pleasure. But once you know about the wishbone shape sort of wraps around the entrance to the vagina. So it's not an either-or situation in the way that Freud saw it as being. I think that's very interesting. One of the people I talk about in the book is Princess Marie Bonaparte, who was completely convinced that her clitoris was in the wrong place. And that the answer to her lack of sexual pleasure was to move her clitoris and actually had it surgically moved. Now, you can release the flesh around the clitoris. That is something which is done, which makes it a bit more penis-like, makes it a bit bigger. Because remember, the clitoris is also the lady penis, the female penis in the history of medicine. Which is fascinating, because if you put it the other way around and say the penis is the male clitoris, whoa, that doesn't feel right, does it? Of course, the male has got to be the normal form, and women have got to be the weird form. Of course,
I don't think there's any normal form. Anybody can call it what they want. That's all right.
But the terminology is fascinating, and as you say, that the floral thing. So the idea that somehow sort of touching your clitoris is a bad thing. So you talk about self-pleasure and mutual masturbation. That's one of the issues when Colombo describes this moment in 1559. It's if you touch it with your little finger. So if anyone touches it with their little finger, if the woman touches her clitoris, she'll have pleasure. If another woman does, she'll have pleasure. This is very scary to the patriarchy. You can do this yourself. Oh my goodness, who needs men?
Right. That's funny. Yeah. It is interesting. I still find it, quite fascinating. I mean, when I think about, these aren't connected at all, but there are so many unanswered questions about our own bodies that we don't know. Why do we still have an appendix? Why do we have wisdom teeth? Do we need tonsils?
Oh, tell me about it.
Why can you take your gallbladder out and still be fine?
Story of my life, right? I have no tonsils now. I have no adenoids, and I have no appendix. I've got all those missing bits.
You're slowly taking out your part.
Slowly removing it. Well, I recently discovered I have a left atrial appendage. I didn't know that. Do you know about that one?
No.
Your heart, in your atrium, have a left atrial appendage, which is like a windsock in your heart. flappy bit that's left over from some earlier
I didn't know this.
growth in the womb. I didn't know I had a left atrial appendage. I now have my left atrial appendage blocked with an umbrella. Get that?
Wow.
It's called a Watchman device. There are others available, which is done to reduce stroke risk.
Sure.
So it's like, I didn't know I had a left atrial appendage.
Mm.
I mean, why not? And even when you go to the cardiologist's office, he has a poster on the wall of the heart.
Yeah.
Doesn't mention the left atrial appendage.
Yeah.
You know, it's not even on the poster. And then I've discovered I've got one. We've all got one.
Well, it's also interesting, like, again, you think about all these things, and then you think about, we have no idea. I mean, I shouldn't say no idea, but we're still, so minimal information on, obviously, consciousness, the state of dreams. But then I just kind of put the clitoris in here too. It's like, obviously it's incredible pleasure for the woman, but beyond that, I mean, you're talking about 1990. 30 years ago, 35 years ago.
That's what we found out.
I mean, there's still so many things we don't know, which is, again, it's just kind of just a marvel. It's just kind of a marvel of, we can say some things conclusively, but even things that we know, I mean, we've been walking around in our current form on the planet for, 40, 50,000 years, and we're still unsure of, what's things that we wake up every day, we walk around, and we don't know exactly everything about it, which is, I in some ways, it's quite remarkable.
It is extraordinary. It is extraordinary. And there are various surveys which have been done where you grab a person in a shopping mall car park and say, here's a picture of the female genitalia, label these parts. And they've got no idea.
Oh, yeah, no, everyone fails that test. Every time I've seen these YouTube videos or things like that, everyone just...
Everyone fails.
They fail. Yeah, it's
well, you wouldn't fail. Now you've read the book.
Right. I can get maybe a passing grade at this point. A hard bit you mentioned in the book is FGM, female genital mutilation. It just sounds so grotesque and gruesome. I mean, you mention it in an interesting way. What is the kind of stance, or I don't know, say stance, but the things you're trying to describe in the book about FGM?
I think, one of the things I'm trying to describe is just that historically it's not been something associated with other people. It's something that we in the West have done. I think that's important because it's very easy to just say, oh, it's something which happens in parts of Africa and they don't understand what they're doing. Actually, no, it's been part of Western medicine in the US and the UK in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And I find that terrifying, that women were having operations to remove their clitoris or reduce their clitoris for all sorts of reasons, whether it's something like a mental condition or a physical condition, or just because they were awkward. You answer back to your husband, next thing you know, you're off to Isaac Baker Brown's surgical home for gentlewomen in London, and then you wake up and your clitoris has been removed. And this is quite extraordinary to me. This is my grandma was born in 1888, right? So it's 20 years before my grandma was born.
My goodness.
Wow.
I mean, I don't know all the details, and so I'll spare listeners gruesome details, of course.
Fine.
But if we know now how large internally the clitoris is, you're not really removing all of it, right? No. You're just removing it topically, and that's, oh my goodness, that's. I mean, again,
there is a positive side to that. So there are people who argue that if you've had this surgery, because it's only looking at the external part, you've still got the internal wishbone structure, so that you are not deprived of the possibility of pleasure for the rest of your life. So there are some people who would argue that. Until you've had it done, I really don't think you can comment on that. But of course, that's when it starts to get tricky, because we want to say, oh, this is dreadful, it shouldn't be allowed. In cultures where it's practiced, it's often the women who support it because they've been told that to be a proper woman, you have to have this operation. So they will resist it. But then they may well turn around and rightly say to us, yeah, but look, you supposedly civilized Western people, you are also going for labiaplasty operations. You're going for hymen replacement surgery operations. You are also altering your physical parts down there. So what's different? And that's really ethically a very difficult discussion to have.
I think that's the question, or that's where the discussion or debate is the reason and motive and intentions behind it, less so about any, the actual act, which is, I mean, again, I think most people would rightfully object to that, but in the context of certain things, whatever it is, whatever the motive or intention is, that's where the ethical debate is saying, okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. It's about motive.
Yeah, I would agree.
And it's also, well, let's face it, it's also about cleanliness of surgery, isn't it?
Oh, well, I mean, yes, that goes without saying. I mean,
yeah, but that's another really big issue, actually. And also, who's paying for it? Who's getting the money? So in the UK, you can still have these sorts of surgeries done by private surgeons if you pay large sums of money. And there's also lots of discussions about whether they can still advertise that they do this. So I don't know what it's like in the US from that point of view. Whether you can
I know it happens. I know it happens in the US. I think it's sort of similar. I don't know if federally funded hospitals and things like that are doing it, but I do know it happens. I think it's some states do it. I think most states don't. So I think it's a kind of a range of things. So
yeah, it's that state level thing where it's different. Okay.
Yeah,
it's a very worrying thing because so much can go wrong.
So the hymen.
The hymen. Well, there's
another mysterious thing for folks.
Well, so obviously, I'm always very interested in reviews and readers' comments on my books and so on. And one of the things that there've been a couple of people getting very negative about is the hymen chapter, saying, "I came out of reading that chapter. I still don't know if the hymen exists." And which I'd say, well, that's great. That's exactly how I want you to come out of that chapter.
Okay. Tell for listeners, I guess, how do we define or understand what it is, I guess, or how that's evolved, how those definitions evolve? I mean, my understanding is that it's a thin layer of skin in and around, I guess it would be the labia, maybe minora, maybe majora, I'm not sure. And sometimes that can, I don't say break, but it can not rupture, but they can tear, but not always. And so, just I guess what is it? Where is it? I guess.
So even where is it? If you look at the history of medicine, that's a huge mystery. Is it at the entrance to the vagina? Is it slightly up inside the vagina? Where is it supposed to be? Nobody really seems to have known. And there's a thing called imperforate hymen, where it doesn't break, where you have a really thick membrane. The word hymen only means membrane, ancient Greek word for membrane. Doesn't mean that membrane. You have hymens all over your body, membranes everywhere. What we call it, the hymen. So the hymen, if it doesn't break, it can lead to all sorts of health problems because things like menstrual blood will clog up and not come out. And you wonder why you haven't got your period. Well, that's because it's all been blocked. And that has to be surgically intervened with to get the blood out. But that is the one end. It's a spectrum. That's the really extreme hymen. At the other end, you have hymens that are so thin and flimsy that you don't even know why they break. They just break. So historically, things like horse riding. Why don't women historically ride astride a horse but always ride side saddle? Answer, because they don't want to break their hymens. Horse riding was a bad thing. Bicycles, when they were invented, were seen as very damaging for hymens. Don't ride a bike, girls, because your hymen might break. And then no one will know you're a virgin. So it all gets back to your whole sexual status, your purity, everything depends on having this membrane, which some people don't even have. And some people's just break and no one even knows it's broken.
Yeah, so this is what I remember reading the chapter, but this is a thing that I still couldn't pinpoint why. Where did we get this idea that a breaking of a hymen is associated with virginity? I really can't understand it. I don't get it. I don't get it.
I don't get it either, actually, if it's any comfort, Xavier. I don't get it either. It is an extraordinary thing to put everything on this this membrane that may or may not exist, and that somehow is your status. So if
it wasn't a fringe idea. I mean, it was completely. I mean, people still today will say things like that. It's a widespread belief.
Yeah, absolutely. And so somehow you have to bleed at first intercourse,
right?
Otherwise,
you're not a virgin.
Proof that you weren't a
someone
virgin.
else has broken the hymen.
Someone else has been there first. It's that someone else has been there first thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it just doesn't work like that. In the ancient Greek world, they don't talk about hymens. They do have the clitoris, but they don't have the hymen. And they're saying a girl will bleed at first intercourse. It's nothing to do with having a hymen. It's to do with the pressure of something being inserted into your vagina, your very young vagina, because we're talking girls being married at 13 or 14. And obviously, men who don't know what they're doing. So you're more likely to get bleeding. But they don't actually talk about hymen. They think there's going to be bleeding, but they don't think there's a membrane. So it doesn't go back all the way through history. Hymens are actually very strange. You have some 16th century medics doing dissection, trying to find the hymen, because they weren't sure if it existed or not. So they would dissect women and find there's no hymen, and then say, oh, okay, well, maybe we'd better dissect some nuns. So if a nun dies, because she's surely got a hymen. And then if they haven't got a hymen either, let's dissect children who've died, see if they've got one. Oh, no hymen. And then rather than saying, okay, no hymen, there aren't any hymens, they say, oh, must be very sort of sexually promiscuous nuns or children who've been exploited in some way. And it's like they really want to find it. They want to find a fleshly marker, a mark on the body that clearly shows whether you are or aren't a virgin. It's huge, because you want women to be virgins when they marry, so no one else has been in there first, and when they conceive a child, it will be your husband's child, not some sort of random child. So that's all about paternity and patriarchy.
Yeah, as you're saying this, I'm thinking of this. I'm like, why there is this, again, this isn't the first time I've heard this or whatever, but I'm thinking about it now in the moment of this fixation with trying to understand women's bodies in this way of marcation or territory or things like that in some ways. The only thing I can think of with men in that way is circumcision. But again, that has, I think it has origins, obviously, with religious context, but it has become a bit more in society about maybe it's, you could say, kind of transposed into cultural, that's what you do. We now know that it can be, more cleanly for the man, but there's nothing attached to it with, social status or your virginity or any of these other things, which seems at the very least notable, right? And you can go all the way with, full patriarchy, but at the very least is notable that we're doing all these things, where for a long time medicine was just, a bunch of dudes, and so they're seeing women in a certain way. And of course we know the history of women around the world that, and even still in some places, unfortunately, where women don't have rights to vote or to do with many things. But for a long time, it was that way around the world. And so it's like, it's hard not to, at the very least, acknowledge that, that's a player here.
Yeah, because people do try and draw that parallel between female circumcision, male circumcision. But it's not as simple as that, is it?
No.
Any of it. And you certainly don't have the idea that something is lost by the man.
There's nothing connected to it at all for the man. My understanding is that with the man, it's just like, oh, that's what you do. Some countries do it, some countries don't. It's more of it's kind of what we do, kind of a cultural, social thing, and then some places don't. Maybe there's still, for some folks, I mean, I'm sure for most Jewish folks, it's still a religious thing. But that's about it. I mean, there's nothing really else attached to it. It's
no, absolutely not. No, absolutely not. And it's an interesting one because it's not as it's this thing that you take someone's virginity. The language is very grabby, isn't it? You take someone's
there's
virginity.
a possessive quality to it for sure.
Yeah, it's possession. And you destroy the marker of virginity in order to make a woman into a woman, a proper woman. It's very strange. Once you start thinking about other types of sexuality, is there such a thing as lesbian virginity?
That's a good question.
it's a question which has been asked by others. And really? Because it's so patriarchal, isn't it? It's so much a man. So that, can you lose your virginity if it's not a man's penis that's doing the job? What if it's a finger? Does that count? Does it have to be a penis? It's really difficult. And it's probably because it's so really stupid as a way of defining.
Well, it's very dumb, and it just feels very antiquated at this point.
It's very antiquated.
Okay,
indeed.
people thought that for a while, but all right, guys, we know how it is now in modern, society, medicine. Like, this isn't a thing, but there's still all this, I guess, ambiguity around it. And you make this sort of connection, I think, at the end of that chapter about the clitoris and the hymen sort of come together in this sexual initiation, and maybe not worried about the woman's pleasure. I mean, how have we seen that kind of overlap with these two parts for the female of what that kind of means of coming together about sexuality and things?
Yeah, so the clitoris is very much about the woman in control, and the hymen is very much not in control. But then ideally, you could say in history that you break the hymen to enter the woman, and if you also give her pleasure on the clitoris, she's then going to release her seed, so you could end up with both seeds meeting and you get a baby. So maybe the idea is you somehow stimulate one while breaking the other, but whoa, it doesn't sound like much fun to me.
Yeah. And then the last chapter, you mentioned it earlier at the beginning about wombs. So obviously you've done work on this and stuff. So in this context, in terms of the female body, again, kind of sort of full circle here with breasts, but just more, it's all internal. I mean, now I will say, to keep it, I guess, pretty from an evolutionary perspective, from a womb is very mammalian, right? It's a very, that's a big piece of it. But what is this? You talk about this wombs as concept in reality continues to be very complex, and then it's of course a marker of female identity. Can you talk about those themes of where what comes up for us?
Sure. So you even get people in the history of medicine, doctors saying that basically the womb is the key organ for the woman. It's as if God took a womb and built a woman around it. The womb is fundamental because without it, how on earth are you going to get the next generation? And the womb is seen as an extraordinarily miraculous organ historically. This is back to the Romans. It's extraordinary because it can retain. It can retain blood, it can retain a baby, it can expel blood and then eventually expels a baby. It transforms blood into a baby. All these things. It's an amazing and powerful and miraculous organ. At the same time, it's a sewer because it's getting rid of excess blood from the body. Now, sewers are not always a bad thing. If you don't have a sewer, you know quite how bad things can be. At least a sewer is some way of getting rid of waste. So sewers are positive in a sense. It's not a great image, is it, really? But also, because you can't see it, there's lots of speculation about what might be in there. And of course, wandering womb theory, which goes back to the ancient Greeks, where the womb moves around the body freely. It's not even anchored. Even when in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, you have the discovery of the ligaments that actually anchor the womb in the pelvis. It was believed they were special extra stretchy ligaments, so they could womb could ping up the body and then get pulled back again. So there's all sorts of ideas there which couldn't be proven or disproven. But the womb was always the fundamentally weird thing in the body. And of course, it's the thing that men don't have. So yes, the clitoris, you can say it's a form of the penis. You can say men have breast tissue. Hymens, of course, men don't have. That's a problem. But wombs, there is nothing. There is no equivalent. And that made it special and also weird. Wombs are quite weird. I talk in the book about the animal imagery, which I mentioned already in this interview. The idea is like a dog that's sort of gnawing at your body. It's an octopus that's clinging onto the baby and pulling it in. It's all sorts of strange animal things going on in the womb. It's very mysterious and very hard to control. Wombs wander because they haven't got enough moisture. They wander because the woman hasn't had sex enough. That's convenient, isn't it? And then what do you do with them when they've wandered? Well, there's the whole history of scent therapy, where you take sweet-smelling and foul-smelling substances. If your womb has moved up your body, you sniff something disgusting, and then you put perfumes underneath the vagina to sort of encourage the womb to go back down again. It has a sense of smell, historically. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Again, it feels very unique.
Yes.
And
yes.
Again, maybe because
it's strange, very strange.
Yeah, it is a strange fact. I always think of those things about, a lot of times we use the image of Mother Earth, and sometimes you'll have these ideas of a holding. It holds all of us. We have these images that we do socially about things, which I find fascinating as well. So I guess my final question for you here is the female body has existed in history, as you detail with these 4 parts, and so knowing the past is important. But how do we see the future of the female body? I mean, obviously, we didn't talk about it a lot in the conversation, but you have folks that are intersex, you have trans folks, you have non-binary folks, and that has also, I mean, it's been controversial in some circles and less so in other circles. But obviously, we are continuing to we still don't have all the answers to, the clitoris. We don't, there's all of these things, the womb is very interesting. So as the female body, we're talking about the female body in new ways. Some ways it's just old conversations and new forms now. But as we keep moving, through the 21st century, how do you think we continue? How can the past help us continue to talk about the female body as, we find these different kinds of combinations of things or new discoveries or, different social aspects?
Well, these are all the big questions, of course, aren't they just? So, on the subject of intersex and trans folks, I think there's something very important here about whether your body is all you need to be a woman. Whether you can be a woman if you haven't got the right body parts. Now, clearly, you can have a hysterectomy, you're still a woman. So once we've got to that point, you can have mastectomies, you're still a woman. So is it really about the body? Is it about having had those experiences? Or is there something more that makes you a woman? Can you decide that you're a woman? Or do you have to have been through, having a training bra and so on and having periods to be a woman? Clearly, it's different if you've had those experiences, but I think you can be a woman without them.
No, this is the de Beauvoir question, right? What is a woman? You can't just be body. Like that's obviously important and super instructive for things, but I don't think it's only or all of that, right?
No, it can't be, can it? It really can't be. And I think what's empowering about history is to find out that some of these questions have been asked for a very long time. And that the answers have not been straightforward. So I talk about some intersex people in the book, and particularly at the point where it became possible to discover that someone didn't have the right organs, the ones they were supposed to have, while they were still alive. So in the early 19th century, they were dissecting people and finding that someone who'd lived as a woman may well not have a womb or may have some testicular tissue. And so what happens then? You say, well, that wasn't really a woman. But then what if that person is alive and you've done some surgery and you've discovered that there is no womb in there? Or you've done a scan and there is no womb? What do you say then? Do you say to them, okay, you've got to now live as a man? No, surely not. They'd be living as a woman. And when they were looking at this in the 19th century, they were often saying she lived as a woman, her habits were those of a woman, she liked keeping house, and she obviously all these sort of gendered stereotypes, and she liked to sew and make things, and she was very demure, and she always spoke quietly. So she was a woman. So they were already saying the fact that she didn't have a womb was not the point. The point was how she lived and what her character was like. I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. And I think actually the key to all of this is intersex, or hermaphrodites, as they were called earlier, or people with disorders of sexual development. You can call this what you like, but it's people whose insides and outsides don't match, which gets back to that whole looking at the body from the outside to gradually going inside. The inside and the outside don't match. Where do you decide that reality lies? It has to lie, I think, in the person's identity.
Yeah, these are the questions that I also ask, and that I try to keep a very wide view of and very open about, because I think anything that we know is always up for modification. And how do we continue to do good science, and how do we do good history to try and understand these things? And so, thankfully, your book is a big part of that. It's very, very, very informative. It's very good. So highly recommended. Helen, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking with us about these important things. I really, really do appreciate it. It's been a blast.
I'm delighted that you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely.